Take one marker.
Okay, anytime.
Look at me.
Okay. My father talked a lot about the union, about how it was organized. At that time, there were 16.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that. We have to start over.
Okay, that's okay. Just continue to roll and start again.
Yeah. My father used to talk a lot about the union, and he would tell me how it was organized. And he said that how they would do it, they would have to get one person at a time. Of course, he would be one of the people. He would go around to a family, and he would tell them about the union, and he would tell them not to tell anybody because they didn't want any of the information to get out. And so, and after they had gotten all the families except one, there was this one last person, and they saved him for last because he was known as a snitch. He would tell everything that was going on. And so, and they saved him for the last person, and when they told him, he did go on and join. And of course, apparently he did not tell Mr. Dibbles because when everything was all settled as far as what the sharecroppers were going to do in the union, and they presented it to Mr. Dibbles, he didn't know anything about it. It was like a surprise to him.
Now, tell me why they had to have this code of secrecy.
They couldn't let the sharecroppers could not let anybody know anything about it because nobody wanted a union because they were very afraid. The sharecroppers had to be secretive because if the plantation owners found out that they were in a union, they would evict them, do whatever they wanted. So they had to be secret about it.
Now, in regard to the plantation owner's response, you told me earlier that their word was the law, that the tenants and the sharecroppers had no recourse, that the sharecroppers, the landowners could do whatever it is they wanted to do. Tell me about that.
Okay. When you lived on a plantation as a sharecropper, the plantation owners, whatever they said was law. The sharecroppers had no recourse as far as anything was concerned. My father used to tell me stories about how even if somebody got killed, if they were a sharecropper and they were killed by another person who was a sharecropper, whatever happened totally depended on how the plantation owner felt about the person who did the killing and about the person who was killed. If the person who did the killing was somebody that he liked, well, then he'll just call the sheriff and maybe let him know that this had happened, but nothing was ever done about it, nothing more was said. The next day, this person would be out in the field working. But if the person who got killed was somebody that he liked a lot, and he didn't like the person who did the killing, then the sheriff would come and perhaps take this person to jail, or they'd have some kind of hearing. There was a lot behind it, but it totally depended on what this plantation owner wanted. So he was the law.
Now, in regard to that,
We're a law here, Don.
okay. We have to change roles of film. No, I was talking to Cora. No,
Okay.
not yet. I'm sorry.
Okay, take two marker.
One of the stories that my sisters told me about living on a plantation as a sharecropper was how the plantation owner had total control over everybody there. And what they would do with the men, if they did anything that the plantation owner didn't like, well, he would just hit them or whip them or whatever, and there was no recourse. There was nothing that this man could do about it. And there was a lady who lived on the plantation as a sharecropper. Her husband was not with her. And so one day her baby got sick, and she decided that she was not going to go into the fields and work that day. And so, of course, the landowner decided that, she was going to go to work that day. And so after she wouldn't go, then he went into her house and he was going to give her a whipping, just like you do a child, and make her work. Of course, he went in, and he and the lady got into a fight, and she beat him up, and she refused to go out and work that day. And nothing ever happened because he was really ashamed to admit to anybody that this woman had beat him up.
Now, the story of living on the roadside that your brother told you about after the eviction to the Dipple Plantation.
Okay, let me see. Now that's before. That's not the tent story. That's on the.
This is living on the roadside when they slept between the logs.
Oh,
and
okay.
how cold it was.
Okay. My older brother told me about the day that everybody was evicted. They had to, all of their things were moved to the roadside. He talked about how cold it was and how the men had to go into the forest and they would cut logs. And they would bring the logs back, and the men would sleep between two logs. They would pile clothes and coverings on top of them so that they would stay warm. And when they woke up the next morning, a lot of times they would be covered with snow because it was very cold, and it was in January, and it was snowing during that month.
Now, when you think back on this and think about how your family, your brothers and sisters were treated, how does it make you feel?
Well, sometimes it's real hard to really think about. I mean, they talk about it sometimes, and they've told me, and I cry easily. And sometimes I really cry just listening to it, and it hurts a lot to think of the hard time that they had to go through. So it's, you know, it's a very painful thing for all of us.
Now, when they were on the roadside, the abuse didn't end there. It didn't just end with the eviction. There was the dynamite incident.
Okay.
Can you tell me about that?
Yes, there was one day that my sister tells me about when this car, she said it was a relatively new-looking car for that time, and there was a white man driving, and there was a black man who was on the passenger side, and she said the car came into the area where the things were out on the roadside. This was in where they were actually in the tent. And there was a table sitting kind of between some tents, and this car came in, and they parked there, and the black man got out, and he ran up to the table, and he put a package down, and then he ran and got back into the car, and the car sped off. Then one of the men who was there in the tent came, and he, walked up to the table, and he picked up the package, and when he opened it up, there were about 6 or 8 sticks of dynamite in there, and it had a note attached. And the note said, "Mr. Nigger, take your woman and your children and get out of here, or we're going to blow you up."
Can you explain to me something we talked about a little bit earlier, the sharecropping system?
How the sharecropping system worked.
And just tell me, as a sharecropper, and then...
Okay. As a sharecropper, the people who were sharecroppers were, they would work the land. They and their families would work the land, and they were to get a share of the money once everything was sold, and they used to call that settling up. But what would actually happen before the cotton was sold, then the plantation owner at a certain time during the year would just give them whatever money he decided that he wanted them to have. And later on, maybe several months later, he would actually sell the cotton, and it would always be when he would wait until a time when the price had gone up or the price was right. And my dad used to talk about it, and he said they would never get what they were promised, and they never got what was considered fair. What they got was a very, very small amount in comparison to what the plantation owner himself would receive for all the cotton, for all the labor that had been put in. He was the only one who really profited anything.
Now, thinking back about the way it was then, how oppressive the landowners were, how do you think that these people, these poor tenant farmers and sharecroppers, were able to come up with enough courage to try to change their plight in life?
Well, it was a great struggle back then. And I feel that they had to have a lot of courage in order to stand up and want to change the situation. And I think maybe it was living together, praying together, talking about it and really thinking that how much worse could it be? It was really very close to slavery when you really look at what happened. It wasn't that much different from slavery, but yet they had to, endure all this stuff. So it maybe was just getting together, trying to see what can be done about it, and just forming a united front to stand and try to make a difference.
So when you think about that, you talked about it a little bit earlier, but you think about that now, does it pain you? Does it make you angry? I mean, how do you feel about all that now?
It hurts a lot.
You want to start?
No, let's go.
I'm sorry.
It hurts a lot to think about it, because when I think about the kind of person my dad was and the kind of person my mom was, they were very strong, very smart people, but they didn't have a lot of education. They didn't have a lot of opportunities. And when I think about that, it really hurts, because they could have done so much. There was so much they really could have accomplished with their lives, but yet they had to deal with struggling from day to day for survival. And it was not because they were hardworking or didn't care or what have you. It was because they really were not allowed opportunities.
Let's stop for just a second.
Take 3 marker.
Looking back and just thinking about what my father and what my mother and my sisters and brothers had told me about the whole situation, individually, they felt that they did not accomplish a lot. They suffered, they struggled, but they didn't see a lot of promise for what they did. But when I look at it as a whole, I think it had a great implication in that was one of the efforts in which people really were being mistreated, and yet they came together and they banded together and they stood up for what they thought was right, and they fought to be treated fairly. And I think somewhere, somehow, that was like a major step in the progress that has been made in general. I think it had a lot to do with it, even though those individual people did not see what they really hoped to see as a result of what they did.
Let's stop again.
Okay. As my sisters and brothers and my parents talked about the Union and all the efforts and everything that happened, even though individually they did not see what they really hoped to see, or they didn't get what they really wanted to get out of their struggle and out of their effort, they really feel that it was a stand. It was important in view of the fact that they took a stand against oppression. They were oppressed. They were having a very difficult time. They came together and they really stood up, and they stood up for what they believe in. And that was a step toward freedom, toward making a change.
Okay. Let's stop again.
I didn't.
5 marker.
Looking back over the whole situation and listening to my sisters and brothers and what my parents had said, as they looked at it, they felt that the effort that they made and the struggles that they went through did not help them individually. It did not change at that time, that much that was going on. But when they look at the whole thing, they really look at how they came together. They were oppressed, they were having difficulties, and they came together as one unit and they fought the system. And that in itself, they saw as a step toward progress.
Okay. Susan, the other question you had, just let it continue to roll. What was the other question you had?
Your father's hope of owning his own land?
Constantly, my father talked about the fact that he wanted to own his own land, even though he had moved and, he did have a small plot of land in Memphis, but he wanted to go back where he could grow crops, and he wanted to grow cotton, and he wanted to do all those things. And so there was a constant conversation that he had that he would go back and buy land. He never got enough money to actually do that, but that's really what he wanted.
Okay. That's it. We're out of film.